Okay, welcome back everyone on Zoom and in person. Next we're going to be talking about a presentation on neurodiversity in the workplace. Caitlin Begg is the founder of Authentic Social, sociological researcher, and host of Progression to Analog podcast. Her research is focused on technology's effect on conversation, socio-technical systems, and artificial intelligence. Caitlin founded Authentic Social in 2016 after writing her undergraduate Harvard sociology honors thesis on digital communication. Authentic Social, offices in New York and Amsterdam, brings an education-forward approach to socio-technical system strategy. Caitlin speaks and presents research around the US and Europe, recently at the Responsible Artificial Intelligence Forum in Munich. Her efforts have also featured in Forbes, Entrepreneur, Mashable, and Business Insider. As the host of the Progression to Analog podcast, Caitlin speaks with practitioners and academics across Europe about ways to explore a more human everyday amidst technological modernity. Guests include Harvard business professor Amy Edmondson and Oxford professor Victor Meyer-Schoenberger. In her free time, some of Caitlin's other interests include film photography, derives, vintage collecting, including out-of-print technology and history of the internet magazines, growing, and editing Wikipedia. Since 5 September 2022, and without exception, she has begun each day reading nonfiction before any cell phone or computer use. Okay, so looks good, and the camera is right there, by the way, okay. Just so you know. So maybe just tell them the questions.
Okay. So if anyone has any questions during the presentation, you can scan this code or go to tinyurl.com/ndcu questions. Hi everyone, and welcome both in person and virtually. My name is Caitlin Begg, and thank you so much for the introduction, Juliet. I'm the founder of Authentic Social and a sociological researcher, and today we'll be speaking about neurodiversity in the workplace and strategies for success in a digital world. I know that you've been speaking a lot about and hearing a lot today about different things about neurodiversity, different angles, and I hope that in closing this conference, we can learn a little bit about how you can take the strategies in your personal life and apply them to your professional life. So first off, today we're going to dive into the complex dynamics of neurodiversity in the workplace and also discuss specific tactics for empowering neurodivergent individuals to flourish professionally and manage all the complexities in this ever-present digital world. Think notification culture and all the overwhelm that comes from that. And what's interesting is I use DALL-E, or ChatGPT's image generator, for some of the images here. And when I prompted it to visualize neurodiversity in the workplace, it referenced noise-canceling headphones, customizable lighting, and personalized workstations. So that's encouraging to know that some of these initiatives for neurodiverse people in the workplace are known and coded into our artificial intelligence systems. So a little bit more background. My name is Caitlin Begg, and I'm the founder of Authentic Social, a sociological researcher, and host of Progression to Analog podcast. And I founded Authentic Social in 2016 after my undergraduate Harvard sociology thesis on how digital communication affects relationships and social interaction. And interestingly, when I wrote my thesis, the only social media platform that people use on an everyday basis above 70% was Facebook. And we found that over 99% of people found that social media platforms affect the way that they perceive others. And so that's already in 2016. If you think about how much algorithmic-based technologies have increased, that really affects everyone, but especially neurodivergent people, because think of all the notifications and the distractions that are ever present in our workday. How can we deal with all of this? So I present my research around the US and Europe. This photo is from me in Lund, Sweden. And I began my career at LinkedIn, and I really did enjoy my experience there, but I also realized the challenges of being a neurodiverse person. I have ADHD in an open concept office. And one of the things that I did, and I'll get a little bit more into this later in the presentation, was I asked for some accommodations. People usually came in and they were 9 to 5, and I went to my boss and I said, hey, I'm the #1 performer on the team. I would like to do well, but it's very hard for me with all this noise. And I said, would I be able to come in at 7 a.m. to 3 p.m.? Initially, it was a no, and I pushed it again and I said, here are some reasons why, put it in writing and verbally. They let me do that, and I ended up being such a high performer on the team that they actually met with the rest of the team and said, does anyone else need these accommodations? And a few people had been afraid to speak up. And so this just goes to show you, there's studies that show that almost 20% of the workforce is neurodivergent. And so it's important to know that you're not alone here and that there's a lot of different accommodations and things that can be done. Another thing that I did to avoid this open concept office and all the noise was I would book meeting rooms throughout the day if I needed some focus time. And I know we've been speaking a lot about neurodiversity today. It's all what the conference is about, but I thought it would be interesting to get a different definition. What does GPT-4, how does it define it? Neurodiversity, according to GPT-4, is the concept that differences in brain functioning are normal variations within the human population, including conditions like autism, ADHD, and dyslexia. And this paradigm promotes understanding and respecting these differences in natural diversity, not deficits, advocating for societal accommodation and support. So it's interesting, at least ChatGPT does advocate for a strength and not deficit model, so that's a positive. So when we're looking at some of the complexities of neurodiversity in the workplace, first we're thinking about some sensory sensitivities, some communication differences, and also distractions, social interaction, and impacts on executive functioning. And in this presentation today, I know there's people on Zoom and in person, both that are neurodivergent people and employers that might be looking to accommodate neurodivergent people. So this presentation is designed for both of those groups. If we look at this photo, we can see some of the complex dynamics of neurodiversity in the workplace, that there's some sensory sensitivities, there's communication differences, there are distractions. How do we manage all of these things? So first I'll hop into some sensory sensitivities. Let's take a look at this photo. As neurodivergent people, and I can say, especially for myself as a neurodivergent person, this photo gives me anxiety. An open concept office is a little bit stressful because it doesn't allow for that deep focus. And especially if you're trying to get things done during the day and we're neurodivergent, it can be a little bit difficult. And interestingly enough, this photo was taken from an article that said, open plan office, great for photo shoots, terrible for collaboration. Data actually shows that even for neurotypical people, open plan offices are terrible for collaboration for a lot of different reasons, because most of us do need that deep focus time, and having interruptions all the time is not great. And many neurodiverse individuals may have heightened or reduced sensitivities to sensory inputs. And so I know when I was at LinkedIn in this office, I put headphones in and I let people know that I had to have some deep work time and that if you needed me, you could tap me on the shoulder. And I had a couple hours during the day where I was doing more passive tasks where I was available for conversation. But because of this, typical office environments can be stressful for neurodivergent people because of the noise levels, the lighting, and even, interestingly, there's studies that have been done on the choice of the furniture. And the sensory sensitivities also extend to workplace communication. And this is really where the heart of my research is and where I think some benefits can be taken from this presentation. So first, when we're talking about workplace communication in 2024, there's both synchronous and asynchronous communication. So first I want to pause and describe what synchronous and asynchronous communication are. Synchronous communication is communication that exists in a steady stream. So this is ideally fully embodied in person for the full effects, but it also extends to Zooms and phone calls. So it's a back and forth. It's that natural exchange where you can feel the natural pauses, and it's a cyclical process. Asynchronous communication is communication that exists outside of a steady stream. So back before technology, asynchronous communication was writing letters. But when you're writing letters, you're taking a pen to paper and you're really thinking about what you're doing. There's a sense of slowness there. Today, asynchronous communication accelerates communication, whereby in my research, I found that there's 8 times the amount of conversation channels per day that we have to deal with. And that's especially overwhelming for neurodivergent people. Asynchronous communication includes things like iMessage, text message, email, Slack, and Teams. But asynchronous communication isn't all negative. There are some positive elements for it, especially for neurodivergent people, but it's especially important that we know how to manage it. And I found this photo to be really interesting. So I took 5 different prompts where I generated this image from DALL-E, visualizing the positives and negatives of asynchronous communication. And I know this is my life a lot of the time. I'm sitting, working from home, and I'm able to take in emails as when I'm ready for them, call people and have meetings when I'm ready for them, and I'm able to get some deep work done. But on the other hand, it can feel really overwhelming to get an influx of notifications, even if you're not in a physical office space, even if you're working from home. So how do we deal with all of this? So first, I want to get into some benefits of asynchronous communication in the workplace. And took a little bit of a different spin here and visualized some of these benefits with pop art. So first, it's about the time to process information. Second, regarding the flexibility in working hours. And third, as it pertains to documentation and clarity. So for neurodivergent people, sometimes it takes us a little bit longer to process the information. We might want to think about how might we want to strategize this response? Because I know with myself, when I was in college and first got diagnosed, sometimes I would respond very quickly to things and not really take the time to think about what I'm doing and saying. So asynchronous communication can be really beneficial for that. Where we can start to get into trouble though, and relating back to your presentation about the executive functioning, sometimes we can see an email and be like, we'll get to that later, and then not get to it. So we have to balance the time to process information with how we actually respond to it. One of the benefits, though, of asynchronous communication in the workplace is the flexibility in working hours, and you can go off of how your body feels. I know I have a condition called postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, and sometimes I'm feeling especially tired during the typical working hours, maybe from 9 to 12, and maybe I'm working from 6 to 9 in the morning and taking a break from 9 to 12. So that flexibility in working hours is nice, and I know neurodivergent people know that the areas of hyperfocus and times of hyperfocus, sometimes we can't control when those will be. So that flexibility is nice. And the third element where we see benefits of asynchronous communication is in documentation and clarity. Sometimes someone could be speaking to us on the phone and our head could be in the clouds. And it's nice to have things in writing. So those are three important benefits. However, there are several difficulties with asynchronous communication in the workplace. And just while I take a sip of water for a second, take a look at this photo and how many notifications and overwhelm that there is from all these notifications and asynchronous communication. It can be very overwhelming. One of this, and the way to explain this, is hypercommunication. So hypercommunication is a term originally coined by French sociologist Jean Baudrillard. I actually wrote the Wikipedia page for it. And it's excess inbound and outbound communication, often precipitated by technology. It's the acceleration of communication that makes things into segmented pieces and not whole parts. And that can be especially difficult for neurodivergent people because when things aren't in their whole part, it becomes very difficult to understand. And it also becomes very difficult, again, to relate it back to executive functioning. How do we prioritize this? I had a friend tell me recently that she's in an organization where in a meeting, she'll get anywhere from 10 to 50 Teams pings in a meeting, and her team culture is such that you have to respond immediately. So part of this is not even on just on an individual level. There's structural, organizational, societal expectations that we need to change. So I want to emphasize throughout this presentation, don't feel like all these things need to weigh on you as an individual. I hope that some practitioners are listening to this and thinking, how might I be able to implement some communication strategies within the organization? That's specifically what my organization focuses on because it's the root of so many dysfunctions in the workplace. Now, communication dysfunctions arise often from asynchronous communication. You might misinterpret a tone or the urgency level of a request. You might not understand what is the type of communication that works best for my colleague, for my boss, for a client. Do they want to be called? Do they want to be texted? Do they want to be Teams? Where are our organizational standards? A project I worked on recently with my company, we found that executives were segmenting and bifurcating communication where they were doing a lot of their important outreach and document sharing on WhatsApp. And this is overwhelming to any employee, but especially to a neurodivergent employee. If you say, you need to check WhatsApp, you need to check Teams, you need to check Zoom, you need to check email, you need to check text, that's too many things, and things are gonna fall through the cracks. So taking a time to segment it and to create, how we start with this is creating your own communication norms. What works for me? In line and reasonably with my organization. So also the isolation and lack of social cohesion. Work from home is really important, especially as it pertains to neurodiverse people, but hybrid model has been found to be the most ideal. Now a hybrid model has many different permutations. So that could mean going once a quarter. That could mean going once a week. That could mean going twice a week. But some type of way to connect you from a collective solidarity perspective to your organization is very important, not just for the individual, but for organizations. If organizations don't prioritize this, attrition rates go up, and then you end up spending 3 times the amount of the employee's salary to replace them. So there's lots of impacts on both sides here. Now, in terms of strategies for success in this digital world, there's 3 things that I like to think about from the outset. There's a lot of different things that we can go on from here, but I like to start with these 3. First is a recognition of strengths, and this is both on an individual level and on an organizational level. So employers first should identify and harness the unique strengths of neurodiverse employees, including hyperfocus, creativity, and pattern recognition. There's a recent study that I found too that found that for neurodiverse employees, what's ideal is limited structure, high threshold trial and error, and pursuing new ideas and problem solving. That's why highly creative, highly differentiated environments like sales, like graphic design, like software development work well with neurodiverse people, because you can work in an asynchronous environment, but there is still a collaborative element to it. It's also important to figure out how can I not only recognize my strengths, how can I communicate my strengths? And this goes to the strength versus deficit model. A study recently found in 2023 that organizations that focused on neurodiverse employees' strengths versus just addressing their weaknesses actually had positive impacts in profit, in employee retention, and in so many different areas. And Harvard Business Review actually covered this. In a 2017 piece, they titled it "Neurodiversity as a Competitive Advantage," and actually found connections to one of the reasons for this was that neurodiverse people's chaos tolerance is much higher than the average person. So when you're in flux as an organization and a neurotypical person might feel like this is out of place, a neurodiverse person might feel like, oh, I can handle this. This is something new. It's also important to realize that hyper-focus and these under pressure elements, working under pressure, I know as someone with ADHD, sometimes if I have a deadline, it's much easier to do it 4 hours beforehand than it is 4 weeks beforehand. And sometimes in organizations, you get into crisis situations and you need something done in 4 hours, and the average neurotypical person might feel really stressed in that environment, but a neurodivergent person really can do that. Also, sometimes neurotypical people might think, okay, 9 to 5, but if it's something that a neurodivergent person can find passion and interest in, that might be something where, wow, I want to spend extra time outside of work within reason and obviously with appropriate payment to do. The second piece is the universal design. And this, interestingly, how I thought about this was not just for in-person office environments, but also for your at-home environment. Basically, the way that I interpret universal design is that employers should design principles that create digital and physical work environments accessible and usable by everyone, regardless of ability to enhance workplace inclusivity and functionality for all employees. And it's also very important for your home office. And sometimes we can forget to do this for ourselves. So make things accessible, make things readable. I know for me, I'm a much better visual processor. So what I did recently was I went onto Facebook Marketplace and I got a whiteboard. It's a double-sided whiteboard. And it's helped me so much. I have all different colored markers, and I put my to-do lists on the board, and I'm able to really categorize things. In my old apartment, I bought this. If you don't want to buy a whiteboard, actually you can go online and you can find a sticker whiteboard, and it's very inexpensive. You can stick it on any wall, and it works just like a whiteboard, and it is really, really helpful because what I'll get into in a little bit of this presentation is integrating some analog elements with digital elements can help with this universal design. If you're in an in-person workplace and you find that there's elements of that workplace that are not working for you, that are not accommodating for you, speak up. And what I've found in my career, especially when I was at LinkedIn, people and organizations oftentimes are not trying to be rude. They're not trying to exclude you. They're not trying to make things difficult, but they just don't understand. I was actually pulled into a meeting when I worked at LinkedIn by my manager, and he said, "We've noticed that you are booking meeting rooms for about 5 out of the 8 hours per day. Is there something that's going on? Are you working on other things?" And I explained to him, I said, listen, my performance speaks for itself. I'm the #1 performer on the team, but it's very difficult for me to perform my job when everyone's talking, chatting, having snacks, drinking beer. How can I manage this? So we came up with a solution that worked, and we had some different people in the office say that actually it was too loud for them too. So at certain hours we adjusted it and there were accommodations met, and that universal design was put into place. So again, if there's one thing you take out of this presentation, it's the communication element of making sure that there are reasonable accommodations, especially as it pertains to hybrid and remote work too. When you're remote, creating those communication norms. How might I be able to, what's the amount of time that you might be expected to communicate or respond to employers? Also, workplace flexibility. So this is going into hybrid and remote work. Employers should offer this flexible work arrangements that balance individual preferences and team productivity. There's been several studies done showing that a hybrid work model is the way of the future. Making people go in for 5 days a week is just not the way things work. I have, again, POTS syndrome, and that means that when I'm standing up in one place, sometimes the blood can flow to my ankles and I can faint. And when I was at LinkedIn, I was doing a standing desk where I was in an office where there was constant noise, and I would come home from work every day and I was so exhausted that I felt like I ran a marathon, and I didn't understand why. Now, making sure that we're asking questions and also diving deep into our own environment. If you're noticing something, if you're in the office and you're coming home and you're not feeling well, you're tracking your symptoms, how might you be able to get some accommodations there? But it's also important, if you're doing your job really well, say you've been at a company for 3 years and the policy is 5 days a week, speak with them, see if they might be able to do 3 days a week or 4. You never know unless you ask. And when you're asking these requests, make sure that it's not just verbal, but that it's also in writing, and that you're saying that there's some benefits to this. There's studies that you can cite that show that there's actually productivity benefits and workplace benefits, because that's what's important. Is at the end of the day, the workplace, we are in this capitalistic system, and workplaces want to have a profitable business. So making sure that you can link those things to sometimes can be necessary. Being vocal and communicative with your employer about your needs is really the important thing to remember here. So next I want to go into progression to analog as a tool for neurodiverse workplace success. So progression to analog is not only my podcast, but there's new episodes every Wednesday, and it's about exploring a more human everyday amidst technological modernity. But it's also about, I did these personal projects in progression to analog to actually hack my own focus and impact my workplace productivity and just overall life satisfaction. I've gone 81 plus hours without a phone in New York. I have a landline in my apartment. I have begun every day since the 5th of September 2022 reading nonfiction, even if it's just a page before going on my phone. And I can say that some of these hacks are really important, especially for neurodivergent people. As it pertains to strategies for success in the workplace, you want to prioritize this balance between collaborative work and deep work. So collaborative work is best done, again, in that synchronous communication, so whether that's Zoom or in person. Deep work is this uninterrupted, ideally alone. So if alone is not possible, communicating these desires to not be interrupted are important, and asynchronous communication is useful here, but it's only within the context of these robust individual and organizational communication norms. And how can we think about what are some norms and ways that we can hack our focus? So what I found in how I improved my deep work was from not going on my phone as much in the morning. I ended up having way more focus, and I've tracked this, and I've actually looked at studies on this too. There's a study about morning wake-up time that was done in Korea, and it found that if you start your morning with any type of habit that's direct, unmediated experience, so it could be running, it could be 10 jumping jacks, it could be looking out the window, anything, your downstream focus is totally implemented. And so from a workplace perspective and an employer perspective, why wouldn't you want your employees doing that? So it combines wellness, productivity, and profit, which is the whole goal here for both sides of this. And remember here that everyone's needs are different, and it may take the time to find the balance that works for you, but I can say that something that's across the lines, and I know this because this is my area of work and life passion, is phones are not designed to help your focus. And phones are not designed to help you be productive at work. And making sure that you are focusing on your computer or a couple areas of communication and communicating that with your workplace is very, very important. And so along these lines, and also something interesting is I'm going to be posting an episode about neurodiversity in the workplace sometime in May. So if you're interested in listening to that, again, we've had different professors on from Oxford and Harvard Business School speaking about a lot of different topics and analog ways that you can make your everyday a little bit better, integrate more creativity and more enjoyment amidst technology and this notification culture. And that's really important because if we want to enact changes on a structural level, it needs to start in an individual level. One of the things that we found across the boards and across different studies and across different research is that integrating some analog tools into your everyday to aid with collaboration, executive functioning is important, and finding the balance that works for you and your organization. Because think about it. If your work is mostly remote, a lot of your day is just digital. And if you're finding that you're tired, you're sluggish, you're not getting things done, your to-do list is slipping out of hand, maybe one of the hacks might be getting a notebook and just putting things down, or getting a whiteboard, or some other different hacks like this. Some of the things that have found to be successful, not just in my own life, but studies have proven this as well. Colored pens, markers, notebooks, and poster boards. Blick Art Supplies in New York City is great for this. Index cards, especially, and one thing, there was a recent study that was done that said in Zoom calls, we are completely understimulated because it's disembodied communication. So if you ever find yourself on Zoom forgetting what you're saying in the middle of the sentence or not really realizing what you're talking about, one of the things I've done is I've actually started to do index cards for important Zoom meetings, because sometimes if I'm not able to remember, having that physical object is very, very helpful. So index cards are helpful. Fidget tools are helpful sometimes. If you have to be on back-to-back Zooms, I mean, there is nothing worse than being on, say, 9 hours of Zoom in a day when you have to be speaking and interacting and you're not having that embodied communication. So making sure that you have fidget tools or ways that you can work with that. Maybe it might be having a physical notebook, because if you're on Zoom and you're taking notes on your computer, you're then looking away from people as you're taking the notes. You might be losing your focus. Maybe you have another tab open. It's also important to work during the day with do not disturb. One little hack too is that there's not just do not disturb and nothing. There's customized do not disturbs. So I have a customized do not disturb during the day where I allow major family members and a couple people from work, and then I also click on the thing double call is allowed. So if someone else is calling me and it's something important, you can double call. But it allows you to control your everyday, control your workday, and control the notifications that are coming in and accelerating. In Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, he's an NYU professor who wrote this paradigm-shifting book about how it's important to move away from a phone-based childhood towards a play-based childhood. He found that on average, we get over 100 notifications per day, and he was saying that it's not really possible to study this in a really scientific way. So actually, higher estimates are several hundred to 1,000 notifications a day. I mean, just think about this. How many times have we all gone on our phone and seen a notification and let it totally slip away? And it works, it all links back to the workplace, because how can we connect with our employees, with our colleagues, if someone's speaking on Zoom and we're on our phone, if we're trying to get our work done and we're constantly interrupted by notifications? It's important to have the visual aids. I mentioned before the whiteboard, and I cannot say that enough, how helpful, and the colored elements of it. That has just been so helpful to me. Also, if there's reading materials that you need for work, some people work well reading on a screen, but I have really found, and there are also studies that support this, that say that especially neurodivergent people, having a physical copy is important, but not just a physical copy, marking up the physical copy and taking notes. And something that's important, so say that you have a 20-page document that you need to get into for work. One hack that I found is you can use highlighters, pens, but you can circle pages that are important and underline secondary in pages. Because think about it. Say that you need to review a brief and you're on a Zoom and you don't have it printed out. I mean, how are you going to go back and forth and back and forth? And these seem like simple things, but we've gotten into such a digital world that it can be hard to remember that sometimes just it is about a progression to analog, some elements in combination. Another thing that's important is blocking, so blocking off time. How I organize my workday, and I recognize that not everyone can have this level of flexibility because I work for myself, but I try to have fewer meetings on Mondays and Fridays and more time for deep work. Tuesdays through Thursdays, I will try to schedule my meetings in as close chunks as possible because I am in hyper-focused meeting zone. So for example, Monday, I'll wake up, I'll do some podcast recordings, and I will do some other deep work and editing and some outbound client reach out, some client work. Tuesday, I'll have meetings from 10 to 3, and then some time for deep work at the end. And it goes like this. So figure out, obviously, differentiating elements in different workplaces, but there's lots of different ways that we can test this and figure out what works for me, what works for others, and especially just continuing to communicate with your employer. Hey, I want to be the most productive and happy employee possible. I want to stay. I want to contribute. Here are some ways that this can help. And I've seen in a lot of projects that I've worked on at organizations that sometimes these things, even though they start with neurodivergent people, everyone can benefit from a lot of these things. And a lot of workplaces can benefit from having robust communication norms in place, for making sure that projects, I mean, think about how many, on a larger scale, how many projects slip through the cracks because of a notification that someone missed or because of an idea that someone slipped out of someone's head because they were looking at a notification. If we want to be the most creative, productive, happy, and successful people in the workplace, it's important to remember all these things. And so in closing, it's important to remember you're not alone. Varying statistics from 17 to 20%, but many studies have shown that there are a lot of neurodiverse people in the workplace. And that 17 to 20% is even by some estimates an underestimation. So it's not as uncommon as some people make it out to think. It's important that outlets like Harvard Business School are saying that neurodiversity can and is a competitive advantage in the workplace, linking it to business outcomes, linking it to things that it's not just a individual wellness thing, which is very important, but we have to remember that there's structural forces at play here and there needs to be a balance there. This asking for proper accommodations is very important, and it varies from person to person and may include any combination of what we discussed today or other items. It might be helpful after this presentation to brainstorm. What are some accommodations that I might be able to work on? And also, what are my strengths? Let's focus on that again. And what can I do to best find my strengths? And I'm someone that also likes to be very realistic. I'm a pragmatic person, and I know that even with our best efforts and our best accommodations, sometimes the employer might not be the best fit for you, and that's okay. You need to really think about what is the best setup that works for you and your needs. Consider your role, your function. If you are someone who might want to have kids soon and the company makes you be in the office 5 days a week, maybe that doesn't work for you. Think about office norms, also in the culture around changing role. Does leadership value culture? Because culture outcomes and companies with highly loyal employees are connected to companies that actually have higher profits, lower attrition rates, and so all these things are linked. And remember that making a change is okay. I ended up leaving LinkedIn and going full time because I realized at the end of the day, being in a structured office environment, even if tech is probably the least structured of a structured environment, didn't work for me. Maybe it might work for you, maybe it doesn't, but think about what does. And take away some of these tips that might be helpful for you specifically. Some resources that I think might be beneficial to everyone here listening and in person is Progression to Analog is going to have an episode specifically referencing links to all the studies we spoke about today in a couple weeks, getting into more of the strategies. And if you have specific questions that you want me to cover on this episode, I'm recording it next week, so feel free to email me. And also, you can learn more about my research at caitlinbegg.com. Progression to Analogs on every Wednesday on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and my social links are there. And thanks everyone for attending, and yeah, have a great rest of your day.
So we have some questions that came in.
Great.
So I'm just gonna stand closer so that they can hear me on Zoom. Yeah, they can hear me. Okay, so someone said, I'm paraphrasing a little, but they said they agree that WhatsApp is overwhelming and that they avoid campus clubs and have even ended club board positions due to WhatsApp group chats.
Mm-hmm.
They don't give their phone number out because text and calls are overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
And this also affects their academic program because they use group chats. So they feel disconnected and isolated because of this, and they want to know, what are your thoughts on this?
Yes, so that is something that is very, very, it's common. It happens all the time. And what I've noticed is that there's two things at play here. First is communicating your needs and saying to people, I'm not always going to be the most responsive. I'm going to respond at a couple times per day. I actually worked with someone recently who had in their email signature, I check email 4 times per day. For her type of work, that work is a highly creative work. What works also is changing the group dynamics and figuring out, is it necessary to put every single piece of this information? Now, I recognize sometimes it's very hard to change group chat culture, but what we can control is how often we're responding and how often we're letting that get to us. And what I would recommend is having structured check-in times, because really you don't need to be reading these as they come in. Sometimes it can be beneficial to be that group chat person who, after the noise has settled down, you actually come in with some type of wisdom. So don't feel that pressure. I've had in my experiments actually, and this might make you feel better, I've tested progression to analog and gone a couple days without messages, and things are just okay. I've gone on the subway without a phone, it's okay. Just create different check-ins and be communicative with your friends. That's the most important part. What I did when I started to use my phone less and started to answer group chats less frequently is I made sure that people know that it's not a personal thing, that it's not that I'm not committed, it's I have ADHD and I need to be doing X, Y, Z, and I'm not on my phone as much. And honestly, about 99% of people have been great about it. And what I found is that actually the group chats have become more enriching. One other thing I would say from this is that in my research, I found that asynchronous communication, or communication that exists outside of a steady stream, is best for exchanges of information. So when are we going to have a meeting? Here is this document. And not things that can be easily misinterpreted. If you're noticing that there are easily misinterpreted items that are being communicated in the group chat, or things that really the tone and interpretation is not clear, maybe mention that to the group. And you could say, hey, might we want to increase the frequency of Zoom meetings or small group meetings or in-person meetings instead of just having all this go in the group chat, because it's difficult to take out what the highlights are there. And you'd be surprised, a lot of people are really receptive to that. And even on a friend level, I've found that I've made that norm with my friends, and now when I go to brunch or lunch with them, we have things to share that we're catching up on. We haven't already texted everything to each other. We're not spending as much time on our phones.
Yeah, I completely agree. So another person asked, how can people handle in-person like microaggressions towards like wanting people to come in person, or also like just being neurodivergent, like microaggressions in the workplace?
So I think one thing to keep in mind is first having a conversation with your boss and with the organization to ask them first, what are your organizational norms and accommodations, and how do you express those? Then understanding what that is, because usually if there's aggressions and people are saying to you, oh, why aren't you coming in 5 days a week? It's a cultural issue. It's a company culture issue, and it's people making people think that you have to be working 24/7 or you always have to be in person. I remember in college, everyone would go to the library together, and I couldn't do that. I would work in my desk, and people would say to me, well, why are you doing that? I said, well, because that's what works for me. Sometimes just speaking your mind and speaking back to the person, but also if it's a repeated thing, trying to have a group conversation and figure out what are the elements here that are making this so. Why does it feel like, why is there notification culture at my organization? And I've worked with helping to fix this at organizations, and it's 99% of time the leadership from top down showing people that that's okay. So it's either maybe there's going to be a change within the organization, or if you think that it's really getting to the point where you're expected to answer things in 2 seconds, it's affecting your focus, you've gone to the proper parties and it's not working, then I'd recommend switching organizations.
So another question, how do you think AI can both benefit and hurt neurodivergent people in the workplace? Are there any examples you could think of?
Sure. So one of the ways that it can hurt neurodivergent people is that oftentimes companies prioritize technical adoptions versus socio-technical adoptions. So for example, when they're implementing a new software, they might think about, oh, this technology will really improve this element of our workflow. But they don't think about from a social perspective, will people actually want to adopt this? Will this take up too much time in the day where people are just checking stuff and don't have time to work? I work a lot with sales teams, and oftentimes we find that salespeople are expected to be on different tools and asynchronous communication over 6 hours a day. How are they supposed to get their work done? So that's one way that it can not be helpful. A way that it can be helpful is leveraging GPT from a personal perspective and thinking about what are some ways that you might be able to improve your personal workflow. So think about what are some areas in my life that I think could be more efficient, or that bother me, or that from an executive functioning standpoint that I have trouble with. One great example of this is taking to-do lists and making them into a plan. Oftentimes neurodivergent people will finish a task and already be moved on to the next task, probably at 90% of the previous task. And they might not want to take meeting notes and turn that into an actionable plan. What you can do is you can actually take a picture of your physical meeting notes into GPT and say, can you formulate a plan around XYZ? It'll spit out a perfect plan for you. And you can iterate it, you can chat with it. And one thing to remember is that when you're using these tools, there's a recent BCG study that said that 90% of CEOs have not taken AI beyond the initial pilot or hype, and this applies a lot to employees as well. And this is because a lot of us interact with AI on a surface level. We're asking one question to GPT. We're thinking that it can solve one thing. But think about GPT as a clay that you can mold into a beautiful sculpture. But if you do it for 1 second, it's not going to mold into what you might like. So if you're training GPT on ways that you think ways that it can help you. Hi, I struggle with XYZ PDQ. When you're making these meeting plans, here's how I'd like you to structure them. Here are some revenue plans or some things that we're working on with organizations that we need help with. Here's a way to do this. So figuring out what in your workflow, and also from an organizational standpoint. But on a personal level, the simplest thing to do is really to just sign up for GPT. There's obviously moral, ethical implications of all these systems, but if on an individual level, there's so many ways that it can help. And the camera button and being able to turn that into summaries has been really game-changing for me and a lot of people that I work with.
It's really good advice.
Yeah, and one other hack on that actually is that if there's something where there's a 6-page document and you are like, I can't read this, or you left it to the last minute and you're like, I can't do this, you can upload it into GPT and say, please summarize these parts of it and please do it in this structure for this purpose. See how that prompt was very specific? That's incredibly helpful for neurodivergent people too. Now keep in mind these systems are not always 100% accurate. You can't do this if you're trying to go into surgery or something that it requires a life or death situation. But if you're trying to sell business to business software and you're trying to look at a company, the summary, that's okay.
And then one person asked, Could you repeat what you said or say more about the types of activities that are good to do first thing in the morning, like not going on your phone?
Sure. So actually, there is an episode of Progression to Analog called No Phones in the Bedroom, ? That is a short mini episode, and it has all concrete tips on this. The way I structure my podcast is that I found from listening to podcasts, I get so bored. I'm like, at 5 minutes in, it's too much for me. So what I do is I structure my episodes where I have some guest episodes that are 40 minutes, but I have some bite-sized ones that are 14 minutes. Really easy, have a lot of tips. So in that episode, you'll be able to listen to everything, more about that study, more about concrete items. But to elaborate on what I was saying before, basically what Korean researchers have found, and this has been repeated in other studies, is that when you begin your day, you are in a state of not being able to really fully function yet. Sleep is still affecting you, you're not fully there yet. And so when you go on your phone or do something that really is pushing you into a lot of different notifications, it's akin to waking up and taking 10 tequila shots. It's really bad for you. So what you want to think about is what's something direct and unmediated that I can do that can start my day. What the study found was that doing a direct and unmediated task to begin your day ends up with more productive outcomes. So my dad here, who also has ADHD and is in sales, he starts every day with exercise. That is a great direct unmediated experience activity. So it doesn't have to be reading nonfiction like I do. It could be whatever you might like. It could be knitting, it could be meditating, it could be anything, but something that does not involve a screen. That was the important element of what the study found. And it couldn't be literally as short as 3 minutes, or sometimes if you have a longer amount of time, more time.
I'm just wondering myself, what are the impacts of I know there's this movement to go away from screen time and things like that. So what do you think the impacts are for that on non-speaking individuals who have to use AAC to communicate and they have to see the screen? Do you think there might be stigma related to that? Something will happen if you're always on the screen, but they needed to communicate?
No, I think what's important is to realize that there are positive ways we can use screens, and there are positive ways that's what my whole body of research is about too, is that it should be a dialectic of exchange between direct unmediated experiences and digital outcomes. Also, depending on your individual circumstance, you might have to use screens for more accessible purposes more than others. It might be helpful to you to use visual aids or other auditory aids or something on a screen. It's important to figure out from a direct unmediated experience perspective what works for you from that perspective and what works around the screen time. And I also think that what I've mentioned in my podcast is progression to analog is a privilege. Progression to analog is something that a lot of, from a structural perspective, and I spoke about this in my last episode, I saw a mom on the subway recently hand her 5-year-old daughter playing Candy Crush, but she looked exhausted. And so if we're thinking about the stigma attached to screens, I try not to judge the individual. We as a society should be judging meta. We should be judging, it makes me emotional. These companies are doing so many horrible things to our society, and really that's who we should be criticizing, never an individual for using too much screen time. Maybe they're not physically able to go and be with their friends. I know I have POTS syndrome, and there's been times when I haven't been able to be in person with my friends, and sometimes it's nice to be on FaceTime or to be texting them. So there's lots of positive elements of screens. It's about really challenging the structural elements of all this and finding a way to find what works with you in terms of screen time and direct unmediated experience.
So we only have 1 minute left, but someone just asked, I feel the need to turn off the camera throughout Zoom. Is this related to neurodivergence?
My dad should answer that question. He's the camera off king. But yes, part of this is because, and it's funny, when I'm on the phone a lot of times, I am very similar to my father in that I'm actually very creative when I'm pacing around and walking. There have been academic studies to back up that actually brain flow and ideas come out a lot when you're walking. So what I've done is I've just communicated this to various clients and partners. And actually there's a client I work with, the CEO, he sometimes gets on the Zoom in the car or in a different place and it makes it normal. And he goes on, sometimes what you can do is go on for a minute at the beginning, establish that sense of presence, say hi, and then just hop off and go video off. That's what I found to be a reasonable accommodation that a lot of companies have felt comfortable with. and communicate that with your employer. It's very normal to not, I don't think we need video on all this. It's too much. It really is. Someone doesn't need to see everyone on micro things. If I want to be drinking a smoothie while we're on the meeting once in a while, that should be okay. But I think you need to think about, what kind of meeting is this? Is it with a prospective client? Is it with my first time meeting with my boss? Whenever my rule of thumb is, whenever you're trying to make a first impression with someone, you should be video on. Whenever possible, unless something really extenuating. From a norms perspective, if it's a frequency meeting where it's every day, that's a little ridiculous. And if it's something where it's taking up so much of your time, that's also ridiculous. I think also going on and off is something that sometimes happens, and it's sometimes okay. Sometimes that's normal. So figuring out what are your individual norms, what are the organizational norms, and realizing at the end of the day, if you're connecting with your fellow employees, if you're getting your work done, people don't say anything to my dad about the camera being off because he's a top performer. So at the end of the day, and connects with everyone and likes everyone. So it's all about figuring out how can you make sure you're socially integrated with the organization, getting your work done, and doing what's right for you.
Okay, well, this was amazing. We had so many questions, and yeah, thank you so much for coming today and presenting.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks. Appreciate it. Yeah, you can take a little picture.
So, okay, sorry. Could you just mute the Zoom? So we'll be back in a few minutes to do the closing.